So, a couple of things I'm going to do in this debate. First of all, we're going to do some characterization of the status quo. Then we're going to go into arguments about how this will lead to a more stable society. How private schools lead to a less stable society, and by eliminating them, we'll have a more stable society. How it is fundamentally inequitable to have private education, and finally, how this will lead, how private education makes education worse overall. Now, on the characterization, presently, there are public schools, which everyone has the entitlement to go to, and there are private schools, which you have to, private religious selective schools, which you usually have to pay some additional fee or pass some particular test to enter. We will note that there are public selective schools, and these will probably continue to exist in whatever circumstance. Just because there's an interest that the government would have in doing that. And presently parents have an input in regards to, like, compared to religious schools. In public schools, parents still have an input about religious education as they get to decide what sort of scripture they're taught in public schools. And private schools are just fundamentally inequitable. It's a distinct advantage given to the wealthiest people in society that the poorest don't have. And in a liberal democracy where everyone is valued as fundamentally equal in rights, equal in their humanity, it's completely unfair for your status of birth to determine your life prospects. Which leads succinctly onto that argument about said inequitability. They have that distinct advantage, and if private schools were eliminated, all children would go to public schools. This levels the playing field, right? It means that no one particular person is going to get a distinctly unique and better advantage in their schooling. This isn't to say that economic background advantages won't be eliminated. They will still have access to tutoring, but when in the hours where children are forced to have an education, forced to go to school, it is equal. Everyone has the same rights, and it is not only an investment of money, but it's a further investment of time if that advantage needs to be taken, which further levels the playing field. And the argument, as such, that social disadvantage is weakened, and there's an overall uplifting of the standard caliber of education. That's a different argument, but that inequity is resolved, and that we break down ideas of persistent wealth, and generational advantage, and that's really good. Yes.
What do the people now attending the public schools do with that money that they had that they previously spent on the private school?
They can do that what they wish. They can do with that whatever they want, and fundamentally, that's a decision for the private school people. And it's not like, let's make this clear. Private schools are not good for most parents who send their kids to private school. Most families who do that, like, it's good in that they're giving their children a good education, but it's such a huge amount of money. Standard private schools, it's about like $20,000 a semester. That can eat into housing, eat into food, eat into other basic necessities. And if that's eliminated, then you can provide better welfare for your child, not just better education. No. So, on to a better homogenized and stable society. So, if private schools are eliminated, public schools accommodate anyone. They take in anyone and everyone. Presently, private schools take in the affluent, while public schools take in everyone else. This creates social bubbles, right? Your formative years are very important to your development, your belief, what you think of the world around you. And people who go to private schools will be surrounded by people who think the way they think. For instance, that this is a classic talking point, that people who are poor should just work harder without properly realizing their distinct advantage in going to a private school that they have over other people. So mechanizing this, if we have everyone in the public sphere, these bubbles disappear, right? Because there's cross collaboration between different social groups, different social classes, and they're able to build, they're exposed to one another, and perhaps most importantly, they build real and sufficient relationships with one another. this shows everyone the differences in social standing and how this is somewhat inequitable and it's not exactly fair. And overall, it leads to a well-rounded, more accepting society because education defines the societal personality because, again, it has such an impact on those formative years. And as such, overall, there's just a reduction in discriminatory behavior. In those formative years, you're exposed to a bunch of people and you see that, okay, there's different backgrounds and that's okay. I can still be friends with these people because you surely become friends with them during your schooling. And as such, this leads to a more stable society with less crime and less discrimination. And we think that's a really good thing. It's really important to have less of that. We all think it's bad. And it also can lead to more so to build further onto that society. Education has a huge imparting of power to impart values. And if we unify that through the public education system, then there's also going to be less social dissonance, less disagreements over things which should be fundamentally not disagreed about. I'll take that point now.
By virtue of its nature, does a liberal democracy not seek to provide equitable opportunities for all citizens?
Obviously, and that's what we're doing. We're providing an equitable opportunity through the public education system. It's not. It's unfair to say that it's less equitable if people don't go to private school, and that's because of our final argument. In the info slide, it talks about how governments support these private institutions through certain governmental mechanisms, funding, scholarships, etc. That is money that governments put into private schooling that don't go into public schooling. There is there is resources that exist that could go to the betterment of all, that go to the betterment of the few. These resources, if private schooling is eliminated, would be redistributed back into the main sector. And people would expect that as they would expect education funding to remain the same. Additionally, private schools currently hire what are considered the best teachers, just because teachers will want to get paid better. And we obviously want teachers to get paid better overall. That's perfectly fine. But sorry, is that time? Okay. Probably with that.
Yeah. We're doing it, but it's probably different from. All right, I think that's for the speech time by the leader of the opposition to begin their case. Firstly, just address the characterization put forward by government. Go into substantive about how our side actually improves the quality of education, how it improves our democracy, and how it benefits the principle of choice in a liberal democracy. So basically, the government puts forward sort of this characterization that funding sort of to private schools would sort of move to public schools, but it fails to recognize a few things, mainly that like private schools are like hugely like funded by the student contribution, like that is made by families. So, you know, they could be spending $5,000, they could be spending $25,000 a year, whatever that might be, like that is going to the private schools. So if you just say, oh, we'll take the like tax concessions and like the less amount of funding that's given to private schools and then move that to the public system, like clearly that's not the same amount of money as was taking to run that school. So it's not as simple like as transferring those funds. So, and then further, the model that like they're proposing, right, which is like basically to get rid of private schools, which would get rid of private schools. They failed to explain how this would actually work, right? So you get rid of private schools, right? But the demand is still there for schooling, right? There's still children who are now not at a school, right? And the extension of that is that they then go to the public system. So what happens to those public schools? They're overcrowded. You know, they're filled with students who have no longer got anywhere to go. So we think that their model, they failed to characterize how this would actually work. And that moves on to my first substantive, how our side of the house best improves the quality of education. So the government, as a stakeholder in this debate, has finite resources, right? It cannot afford to just like spend infinite amounts of money into the public education system. And the reason why this is important is a few things, right? The private system currently is really important because they can better support students with different needs. And this is really important, right? For students wanting to have an education that's reflective of their religion or their culture, students that might need extra support because they might have a disability. Like there are specific private schools which are basically set up to cater to these students. Now, under a public model where there are no private schools specifically to cater to this, the public schools, which would have a mandate to be secular and free, as you know, the government puts forth, cannot actually like support these people. How is the government going to set up the correct infrastructure to be able to do this? Like it's you know, private schools can offer these specific different opportunities, which allows that degree of choice. Yeah, I'll take your point.
We brought up the idea of scripture and other things like
yeah,
that.
I'll get on to that. I get on to
And as such, isn't it, and solely with the elimination of private schools, more cultural elements will come.
Look, so you say that public schools, like they still get to choose scripture, but this is not the same as the environment of like a private religious school. Like we just reject that completely. Like a private religious school where they might integrate like religious services, cultural services like perhaps a mass, or you know, attending like a church or a mosque. Like this does not occur under a public system. Like you cannot say that like a crappy little scripture class in some room like is the same as that like cultural religious education which you might see from a private school. Now onto my second further on that, you raise the issue of teachers and you basically say we want teachers to be paid more. And then like you fail to mechanize how that is like eventuated in your system, right? So currently teachers have the choice of either like working in the public sector or the private sector, right? Now, obviously the private sector often pays higher than the public sector. This provides teachers with a degree of choice as to like what they enter into. And so if there is the option for teachers to enter into the private system to possibly get paid a higher wage, then that puts pressure on the government to raise like wages for teachers in the public system to encourage them to stay in the public system, which is what we're seeing currently in New South Wales. So we don't see how teachers are any better off overall, because in this liberal democracy, they don't even have the choice of where they want to work. Now, onto my second point about a democratic system. Ultimately, in this liberal democracy which we put forward, it's characterized by freedom of choice and democratic system, which looks at different experience, different backgrounds, different cultures, different says and viewpoints on the world. Ultimately, education has a significant impact upon I'll take it.
So how is the public school in regional areas supposed to operate and thrive when all the people who's actually like discriminate way to a different school?
Well, we think that if you did not have private schools and in a public regional area you had like one underfunded or like poorly funded public school, even if it is funded, like and you send all the students in that area to that one school, it's going to become overcrowded. It's not going to be able to cater for specific needs because it simply won't have the resources to provide like things for people who need like different access to such things. So it would actually be a disbenefit to those living in that community. Now onto my third substantive, and that is that in this liberal democracy, we prioritize the principle of choice, right? That is the choice for people to send their children to whatever school they wish. Now, government wants to remove that choice and they want to force all people to attend a public school. They put forth this argument and they say private schools are bad because parents spend a lot of money for them. But the parents aren't forced to spend the money to send their children to the private school. It's their choice that they do that. You know, if they didn't want to spend that money on the private school, they could have the choice to send their children to a public school. If the parent chooses to send their children to a public school and would like to put some of their money towards their child's education in the private sector, we think that is a good thing. That is fine. That offers a principle of choice. Just as a parent doesn't have to send their child to a public school, they don't have to send their child to a private school. Ultimately, what this leads to is people are incentivized to spend money in good places. We have a free market where parents can send their children to schools they wish. What does that do? That opens a level of competition where schools fight to get children to come to their schools. Schools want to offer better services, right? And so if there are all these like private schools that are trying to like compete for people to send their children to them, they're going to provide better services and they're going to be more incentivized to provide services for people who are not adequately getting them in the public system. And like I recognized from before, it is simply just ridiculous to propose that we should wipe out private schools and put the whole burden of our schooling, which is like private schools make up a lot of schools, by the way, which is not characterized either by government. They're significant, like they form a significant number of the schools we have in liberal democracies, not just in Australia, but around the world. Ultimately, when you remove this entire education system, what happens? Does the government like buy all of these schools? How do they then like run them? We have a finite like resource as a government. What this does is it saves the government money because they can actually spend it elsewhere to better improve education on like health, housing, etc. Ultimately, this just provides people with a degree of choice. The schools are running, the government's not having to pay as much money for it, and we get choice and reflective of this liberal democracy. Proud to oppose.
Please are reminded that per bench you can only ask a POI once every 15 seconds.
Sorry, my timing was off. Sorry about the
Cool. I think the leader of the opposition for their speech, and I invite the deputy publisher to conclude OG. Here.
One, during the speech, firstly, just like a general rebuttal for our opposition, and then secondly, linking that into our substantive, and thirdly, why our substantive is just like far more important than what opposition has actually given you. So, firstly, in terms of like, I think basically just like their main few impacts. So, firstly, they basically tell you at opposition that it will result in like better support for students with like different needs and stuff like that. I'll get to this shortly, like in more depth with our substantive in terms of why we think that impact would actually be a better result, like would actually be more beneficial on our side of the house. And that is basically because we think that like public schools and stuff like that actually probably like teach more in the way of tolerance and stuff like that, are more accessible to everyone in like different demographics, which opposition has ignored thus far. And so we think that like because of those things, that public schools and the fact that like most people do go to public schools, I'll get to in characterization, and that's probably like just super important because it means that those public schools would have an incentive to cover for like disability ramps, for things like having a level of like religion and stuff like that available to their students, because we think that like most people do actually just go to public schools anyway, which just to like reiterate our characterization. Okay, so secondly on that, like I said, most people go to public schools and stuff like that. And we think that the reason for that is because just like private schools and select schools just like aren't very accessible to most people in the population. We think that for a few reasons, right? So firstly, that just like cost money that most people don't have, and we think that that looks like particularly like minorities, families of like low SES and like low SES areas, and especially like parents and stuff like that. We just think like it's generally out of reach for these groups because of like financial disadvantages and stuff like that, and so we don't think that it's all that equitable that they actually have like those disadvantages and stuff like that. Right. So we think this has a few main impacts. The firstly, just like I suppose that in the idea of like accessibility, right? So we think that having that accessibility and then kind of just having that out of reach for them will create the notion of just like the word I'm looking for, like just kind of like elitism, I suppose, in the sense that, you know, they're over there and stuff like that, they're like all rich and stuff like that, and then you're basically just like segregating like most of the population, right, who actually like probably can't afford to use like private schools and whatnot, which cost a fuck ton of money, which most people don't have, like I said, especially like low SES minority stuff like that, regional areas and stuff like that, as we've brought up already, right? So we think that like the next main impact of this is just that it will like teach greater tolerance, I suppose, because as a result of this, right? So you're going to have people of like more mixed races, more people of like, you know, different like what I'm looking for in terms of like accessibility, disability, stuff like that, actually going through these schools. And we think that, you know, most kids like actually being embraced in this like more diverse culture and stuff like that, that will actually just be like far more beneficial to them. And we think that's like the most important thing in this debate, right? We think that you know, those equitable outcomes for these students, right, when they're embraced in, you know, more like diverse culture, they will learn to become more tolerant of these cultures and stuff like that. We think that's obviously important because, you know, without it, you know, people will just grow up thinking like, oh, well, you look different to me and stuff like that, and that's obviously not good. You know, obviously, teaching the whole idea of basically just treating everyone fairly because you are like embraced in that culture and stuff like that. You know, throwing around like people who, you know, look differently, speak differently, look different, whatever. Okay. Next piece of substantive. Yeah, okay. The next piece of substantive is basically just how like government involvement and bureaucracy, how that is relevant to this debate. So basically just like the idea that, you know, private schools and stuff like that are actually just like, you know, different from government schools in the fact that they don't have to follow all these like, you know, rules and stuff set by the Department of Education who like know what they're doing and whatnot and set like these particular regulations, stuff like that in most departments. Okay. So we think that like government schools, public schools probably do spend more time actually focusing on what's important, what's it's set in like the Department of Education's proper curriculum, stuff like that, more so the private schools. I think that for a few reasons. So private schools probably have like the ability and stuff like that to do more, I suppose like extracurriculars and stuff like that, which aren't necessarily a good thing for the student's education. We think that like public schools would actually just result in like more accessibility, more opportunities and stuff like that. Like I said before, most people do actually just go to public schools in the first place anyway. And so that would mean that they would have a greater pool, greater resources, greater like number of people which they can draw from to go on like, you know, have other extracurriculars, you know, go on like, you know, have like other opportunities which perhaps would be there on their side of the house, but not to the same extent, not as beneficial or, you know, like take a point from closing if you have one.
Why is specialization in education bad?
That's our whole case, right? So specialization in education, I suppose, just in the sense that, you know, it's fine and stuff like that, but basically on our side of the house, education, more equitable outcomes for both societal outcomes, individuals' education is just like far more important than anything which opposition has given you thus far. Okay, no, okay, different needs. Okay, yeah, moving on to basically opposition's impact of basically like better support for students with different needs. I kind of went over this before in my like equitable outcomes argument, but basically we think that like more like diverse needs and stuff like that will actually be accounted for under the status quo in like public schools and stuff like that. And that is because like I said multiple times, most people do go to public schools and they would have the incentive to actually like accommodate for most people because they do have like most the pool of people. Which does include these like different groups. Like our PM said in our characterization, things like specialist schools in terms of, you know, disabilities and stuff like that, they would still exist, like public schools in that way. Things like, you know, selective, like academically selective schools, high schools, stuff like that. These like selective, specialized public schools would still exist, but they would still achieve all the positive impacts which I've outlined in terms of them still having the government involvement, which is a good thing, and having greater equitable access in terms of just having like a more diverse thing, more diverse pool, I suppose, of students, which would be teach them tolerance and stuff like that, and would overall just be like more beneficial for them like growing in the world and getting to meet other people and stuff like that.
I'm proud to govern.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, for the speech, and I invite the Deputy Opposition to close the open file. Yeah.
From government here today is essentially that private schools are bad because they're discriminatory, and that like public schools will somehow be able to provide better diversity that leads to better democracy. There are a couple of reasons for why this is not true, but first into what I'll do in my speech today. I'll be addressing some rebuttal here. I'll be trying to mitigate some idea about like rural schools coming from closing government, and I'll also be going to substantive about like how we're the only team to actually give you mechanisms for why we would get a better quality of education under the current status quo using school choice. So firstly, in terms of rebuttal, like this idea that like private schools are like inaccessible, financial disadvantage, and elitism, like have you seen selective schools? Like they are by nature discriminatory. Under your model, you would maintain that they somehow exist. It's unclear why these two harms would not be the same. And secondly, in terms of private school inaccessibility, like I will like later talk about like how like private school, I'll later like mitigate some of the impacts of like the difference in financial advantage, which like probably remain like rich people and poor people remain on both sides of the house. I will actually address how this will occur and how this will be better like addressed through school choice in my case. Secondly, this idea of like social, like stable society, like they try to weaponize this idea of like public schools will now allow for diversity. They like entirely ignore the characterization Will gives of like we have finite resources. Why, when we're struggling to fill teachers into schools, where now like you have like 120 kids being taught by one student, like where would they get money to build a disability ramp for potentially one person for 6 years? It seems like unclear, given finite resources, why like schools would have money to do this when we are already struggling so much. So I think the first thing to say then onto the mechanisms and the incentives. So school choices it provides the only incentive for parents to actually give a shit about the delivery of education in a liberal democracy. Why is this? I'm sorry. Let's firstly look at the impact. So if I can prove this, then what I prove is like this probably leads to a higher quality of education for everyone, regardless of income. Secondly, it leads to an aggregation of the quality of education. It means we don't get wild disparity. Thirdly, it means actually a general higher we guess increased accessibility of better quality education. For people who may not be able to afford it otherwise. Some reasons for why this occurs. So firstly, if you are able to choose your school, it seems very likely that you would give a shit about how your money is being spent, regardless of where on the wealth divide you are. So if you go to a public school and you contribute like smaller school fees, you would be scrutinous of how that is being used. If you went to a private school, and there are ranging private schools here, you go from independent schools, which are like much cheaper, to like very expensive I don't know, like Knox Grammar. So in terms of this scale, like you can't just be like, oh, people like rich people will just like send their kids to like poor people's schools. The reason, okay, I'm going to talk about that later, but like, so given that this happens, what schools do is they kind of aggregate the experience of all the students who go there. So when parents, regardless of where on this like income scale you stand, put money into their school, the school then takes this collective fund to then determine the best amount of experiences or like infrastructure that they would then deliver to their students. So why is this like a sort of aggregator? So this is an aggregator because parents who are pushing slightly above their income or like spending a lot of money on their child's education, their kid receives the same level of education as someone who's comfortably spending that much money. What this means is that on aggregate, decentralization through the private mechanisms of schools is able to deliver multiple standards of education that parents can then opt into depending on their income variances. It seems important in a liberal democracy to maintain liberal rights. I think let's actually see this in a case example of why this is true. So under OG, everyone would send their kid to the same school. What would happen here is rich people are still very rich, and they probably note, given the characteristic, that they don't have proper infrastructure, they probably have underfunding, there's probably a really big mix of school levels and ages. So what then they're going to do is they're going to use their disposable income to put them into things like debating, put them into things like public speaking, put them into things like extra internships or going into sport, stuff that other poorer parents wouldn't be able to do. So then what happens here is we get a massive wealth divide because these students are being equipped with academic and life skills much before their peers. We think that this leads in the long term to wealth disadvantages and less class mobility. So under our side, what would actually happen is so they would stop diverting their financial resources into the private sector where there's no scrutiny and there's no oversight and they're not able to do anything about it. And instead, they would actually divert these resources into the school kids. So they wouldn't trust in the school to kind of be providing these opportunities instead. This also means that other students are able to access this. Reasons for why this would not be inaccessible as government may claim. So under the Gonski scheme, which is this is an example. Under the Gonski scheme, the government provides incentives for which is in the info slide. It provides incentives for private schools to give scholarships or to get more funding when they accept students from disadvantaged areas, regional areas, etc. Another point here to make is that in regional areas, lots of the time there has to be independent schools because the state system is just not able to send enough justify sending enough resources out there. Oftentimes we find in rural communities that community looks after itself. It recognizes the need so personally of having good quality good education. I'll take a point from closing.
So if rural schools was so important, wouldn't it be better to keep these high-income families in the rural system so they lobby for better?
Yeah, high-income families want to stay in rural communities, so they're so welcome to. But if they want to move for class mobility or to get better economic access, it seems weird to no, this individual in a liberal democracy should be fucked over and used as the cash cow for poor people. Surely it would just be let's send more support into these poorer areas. Alternatively, it would be looking at what financial resources currently exist. Another point to make here is rural communities are generally also religious, or they have very similar demographic characteristics. It seems weird for government opening to also claim that diversity would happen when they give no mechanisms for why that is likely to occur. They probably have not seen stabbings that happen in Western Sydney in schools where there's ethnic conflicts. So I think it seems, and then also diversity is given that there are actual incentives under private schools to accept diverse people to get more government funding, it seems more likely that they would actually be able to have the resources to support this sort of diversity rather than having it descend into ethnic conflict chaos, right? And that seems likely to be the case because there is nowhere in the curriculum where it states you should be teaching kids about tolerance and acceptance. It's just it's I don't know. I'm not going to give mechanisms why it might occur, given that it probably doesn't occur when teachers are so cruel to fit 6 hours of content into a day of teaching. And yeah, for those reasons, I would like to oppose.
I think the education I might see coming industry begins where bottom up.
Did you want your speech recorded?
Yeah, sure.
We can send it to you or something. That's
Three, two. I don't know why this debate became about the people of the upper income class. The spirit of this debate is purely just to increase the level of education for all, and where this lacking at the moment is in regional areas and low SES areas. And the main reason for this is not just school funding, it's about governmental grants. And that's what we'll be focusing on closing government. These governmental grants are something that aren't guaranteed. So what we see under the current system, and I'll set this up more later, is that there is a current minimum education requirement that the government has set, which has been $16,000 per student. State school students are provided per student in the state school with the $16,000 requirement, and private schools are then subsidized with this based on the income of their parents to reach this period. So every single student gets money. What isn't guaranteed is where these grants go. And I'll get into why these grants are important, but I'll just get into some quick rebuttal. Quickly on equitability about disabled students. Under the current system, disabled students out of school, the school will receive 2.5 times more funding for the disabled students in order to cater for their needs as per legislation. Also, the opposition pose a lot of things about collapse, which is simply not true, because although these private school fees are expensive, like $20,000 as they said, the median as per 2022 is $10,000 per private school, which is pretty reasonable. And what this looks like is that this $10,000 isn't just the school fees, and it is also heavily subsidized by the government as well, by the federal government. The federal government, on average, for the average income earning parent in the average private school provides roughly $10,000 of education. So it is not justifiable to say that all of this, it was just going to, this $20,000 school fees going to get covered by the government. The government was already covering a lot of it already just by just the federal education plan, but it is important that this collapse isn't really justifiable. But so onto my extensions. First extension is grants. Second is about the point of religion, and the third one is about specialized public schools and how they're so harmful. Firstly, on grants. Grants are very important, and what we currently see is under the status quo. For example, public schools in Queensland, that of the 19 public schools built in the last 5 years, 0 of them had built a pool along with that school. The reason for this being is private schools are currently eating up all of the grants in the system. The reason why they can do this is because the government doesn't have to pay for the price of the whole pool. So what the private schools do, they go, hey, we're going to build a pool. You subsidize 10%, which is the metric. You subsidize 10%, and we'll give a bit of access to public schools around it. But basically, the spirit of the system is that most of these government grants are being funneled towards private schools. One, because they're just better at lobbying, and two, they just have the resources to do so. So under the current system, no thank you. It is very much prevalent that all these grants to build infrastructure are going funneled towards private schools. So why is this wrong? Because we think infrastructure is one of the most important things about education. If you're learning about science, for example, you can learn about science way better in an actual lab than just a random classroom. And what we see is that parents who are unhappy with their public school system is because when their kids do science class, but they're not in like some sort of science lab being able to use scientific equipment because it's just generally harder to learn that way, and that's why they're being funneled away. So what we want under this system is without school choice, why we're more likely to see grants evenly distributed is because schools will be able to better identify the quantity of students attending their school, and grants will be able to justify by that. Because you're not going to have like the amount of kids attending the school is based on the population of the area and its growth, and from that you can then easily distribute grant resources proportionate to that, not proportionate to random flows of parents to different schools. So I'll take you in a second. So why this is really important is for low SES areas, that these areas are getting funding proportionate to the amount of people going there, and that these grants are being received, not just being funneled away because most of the rural students that have wealth are going into the city. Yes.
Given that most rural communities are also religious, for example, like Griffith in New South Wales, it's like very Italian Catholic. Like, why would the state system be able to support their religious experience given Will's material that they're so different?
I don't think they should. I think religious and education, the stigma that they should be linked, is not as justified. What we see in other education systems, like the UK, for example, the UK has about 93% of their the schools being public, and also most of those private schools aren't religious based. Anyways, the reason why I think the stigma is particularly bad is because you're forcing parents into sending their kids to a private school to be a part of their religion. But when you go to these religious schools, what is catered to by your religion is a religious class in your timetable and a weekly mass. And I think from a graspable standard, sitting in a mass with a bunch of kids who on average are less engaged with the content of the mass, and also provided by teachers who aren't necessarily, because they're just going to the private sector for the money, they're not necessarily caring about the religious education, is worse off than a stigma that would shift towards religious education being centered around churches and like that. No, thank you. So I'll give a bit more onto this religious extension, and I think it's been generally harmful that this religion and going to a private school has been linked, which has led to a lot of parents who believe that they have to send their kids to a private school in order to be like a member of the religion, and we just don't think that the religious education portion of it is as good as religious education in the church standpoint of like going to your local church, and the education is simply better there, and it is not worth, no thank you, it's not worth linking that to the private education big price tag. Okay, onto rural sites. I think it's really important that these rural sites are developed. The reason why they're not currently developed on the status quo is one, because they're low SES, and two, they're developing. So what we don't see is any link to whether these developing communities are actually going to be have any sustained growth that the government can put funding into, because they don't know whether the kids are going to go out or they're going to stay in. So we think it's really important that these rural areas divvy funding equally as seen in like the UK system, because the UK system, you don't care what public school your child goes to, because the funding of grants is distributed evenly, and you know that on average every school is going to have a science lab, for example. Lastly, just quickly on the extension of why specialised public schools are harmful, I think it's really bad because what happens is these public schools that aren't getting much foot traffic become specialised, like their science school, and then to get more foot traffic into the school because they're in like an area that wasn't specifically good, like that people weren't going to, and that just makes the rounded education for people in that area less rounded and more specialised. So if you're in an area with a state school that's become specialised, and you no longer fall into that specialised category of math school or something like that, it becomes very harmful, because then you have less rounded education for the community as a whole. We think that every single student should have a well-rounded education. Proud to government.
I thank the member of government for their speech, and I'll invite the members of the opposition to begin their case.
Sorry, just a minute. I have, oh my goodness. Thank you. Knowledge about this debate is the model presented by the opening government, which by and large is one that very much opposes school choice, and more specifically opposes the privatization of schools holistically, which I think important to note within the context of this debate, we are specifically talking about liberal democracies. And I think by virtue of their nature, by and large, a majority of liberal democracies are mixed market economies, which rely on privatization in all sectors to merely, I suppose, function efficiently within the context of that government. Which brings me to today's extension, which is that school choice, in light of this understanding that they are primarily mixed market economies in liberal democracies, that school choice provides a long-term solution that not only can produce greater results educationally in terms of quality, but economically, in order to sustain not only the quality of education, but more importantly, the quantity of education in liberal democracies holistically. So first, the mechanisms and the impact and how this would lead overall to a greater access to education, which, to clarify, I think is the main premise of today's debate, is talking about access to education holistically. In turn, yes, the quality of education, but overall the ability for individuals in all areas of liberal democracy in order to attend schools. So first and foremost, by virtue of school choice as a concept, parents are more incentivized to send their children to get educated within governmental institutions, which by and large, by virtue of school nature, not only means more options by virtue of having private schools existing, which I think has been a really central part of this debate. However, I also think it's important to recognise that a big part of school choice holistically as a concept also includes enabling individuals to attend institutions based on scholarships and by flexible district laws, which by and large increases access to education holistically. And therefore, as a result of this, by virtue of population, more children are in schools and are being educated under government regulated systems. And then eventually, by more individuals being educated, you're more likely to have individuals go either directly into the workforce or get additional educational qualifications, either in tertiary institutions or TAFE institutions, which by and large will prepare them for a workforce within a liberal democracy. And then therefore, once you have qualified, educated individuals, you have a greater labour participation rate as individuals transition from educational institutions into the workforce. And therefore, as a result, you have increased employment within an economy. And then, as by virtue of having increased employment in an economy, I'll take your POI in a minute, you have an increased overall disposable income enabled by individuals who, by virtue of being able to initially have greater access to education, had then become educated, had become qualified, and then have become employed. I'll take a POI.
So private schools are so good. Why do education systems in the UK, Finland, and US have better education than us without that?
Well, I think first and foremost, what qualifies as a better education is kind of derivative in this sense, because what you could define greater education as is education that enables employment, which under this model is allowing a long-term solution in order to get individuals educated and then directly into the workforce. So by virtue and consideration of that, once again, we have increased employment, we have increased disposable income because more people are simply out in the workforce earning money, more people are earning enough money in order to spend it however they choose. And therefore, as a result, not only in terms of education, but economically, and this is really important that we widen the scope of today's debate beyond just education, but talk about the economic implications holistically, because what this means is that within the whole context of the liberal democracy society, you have increased consumption and increased economic activity. Why is this important, and why are we broadening the scope of this debate beyond education? Because when you have increased economic activity, particularly under liberal democracies, once again, considering mixed market, is you have increased, for example, taxation available to governmental organizations who therefore can fund it into institutions, which increases the amount of fiscal spending on education holistically, which means whether you go to a private school, whether you go to a public school, any educational institution, not only will there be more of them, but they will be subsequently increasingly funded. And as a result of this, you have long-term solutions in order to increase education holistically. Because at the end of the day, the cycle continues. More people attend institutions initially, the flow and effect to the rest of the economy, and eventually education will actually benefit economic activity and subsequently benefit education at the end.
Isn't it a bit naive to think that greater taxation will lead to more funding in education, given that we don't see any increases in education funding as it is right now?
Well, I think it would be very naive. I think it would be more naive, perhaps, to assume that eliminating school choices holistically would somehow incentivize the government to distribute their taxation in a way that they don't intentionally choose to do so. So I think it's important to recognize that under the premise of a liberal democracy, how do I phrase this? Under the premise of a liberal democracy, individuals, by virtue of the jobs we're attending, will always have a disparity in terms of income to some extent, and therefore the way in which we distribute income within the education system and the system holistically is going to be disparity to some extent. However, I think what's most significant in the context of this debate is talking about the increased access to education holistically, which is really what we're talking about, which is significantly enabled by school choice rather than abolishing it completely. So in light of this, we've acknowledged that school choice not only provides better quality of education eventually as recognised by opening opposition, but more importantly acknowledges an increased access and quantity of educational institutions around liberal democracies and provides a long-term solution. And so I think this is increasingly significant beyond the points raised by our opening, such as things like government fundings, which by virtue of their nature are short-term solutions, and by the complete abolishment of private schools, which I think by virtue of its argument completely narrows the scope of this debate just to private schools, which is not what it's completely about. I'm proud to oppose.
Right, I thank the honourable member for their speech. Now I'd like the government whip to conclude the government bench here.
I think that was did not really was not really explained why that would not why these economic benefits would not be possible with like a good public school sector. So opposition claimed that somehow you get more people in schools if you have like school choice. In liberal democracies, like most of these countries have mandatory schooling and like pretty much like most of the population completing at least high school and also good access to schools. Like liberal democracies generally have like that functional education system where generally people are in school. So like I don't see how more people would like go to school just because there's like more private schools available, especially because like the few people who are currently like dropping out of high school or like not going to school are usually very low SES, so they wouldn't have access to these private schools anyways. These would be completely out of reach to them. So there is no reason why more people would go to school, and therefore there's also no reason why all these economic benefits that they're claiming would then accrue, that like more people would later be in employment, more people would like pay taxes, and somehow that tax money would flow back into education. Not proven why it would even go back into education, but also, as I said, the people who are currently like unemployed, who are struggling, who are not finishing school, etc., are low SES people who would benefit much, much more from a better public education system than from a private education system that is completely out of reach to them. Yeah, so we don't see how there would be a greater quantity of schools, and we also especially don't see how quality would improve. So this is something that both opposition teams have been claiming, that quality of education would improve. So first of all, if anything, it would only improve for the people who are able to afford it, who are able to for whom these like private schools, selective schools, religious schools, etc., are in reach. There is no reason why it would improve for people who can't afford it. If anything, it would be likely that like public schools would like become less of the focus if they are just a smaller share of schools, and that the quality of those could decrease, if anything. And then also, like even for the people who can go to these private or selective schools, etc., we don't think that quality of education would necessarily improve in that world. No, thank you. Because there would just be like, it would just become really, really hard to have any sort of quality assurance if there are so many different types of schools. And this is something that that opposition has not like covered at all, how you would make sure that there is a constant standard of quality if you have all these different schools, like schools that are focused on religion, schools that have like a certain specializations, which might cause them to like lose track of other important areas. as my government member has explained to you, and like not provide a well-rounded education, etc. So it would become like pretty much impossible to really assure like a constant standard of quality anymore. Yes, I'll take opening. Yeah.
Like, let's look at the Christian feelings. So, given followers of Islam or Judaism have such different customs to mainstream, like potentially mainstream society, such as women not being able to show their men to people outside their family, or like kosher food prep, how would state schools be able to support such minorities?
We think that like really strict religious schools actually are in many ways like problematic in themselves. Like you should be like public schools are like legally required to be able to cater to people's important needs, like they can wear their religious dress that they need, they can provide different dietary options, etc. But we don't think it's a good thing if parents send their kids to like really strict religious schools. That also creates strong religious divides. So there is like a lack of diversity in these schools. You never get to talk to kids who are not of your religion, and that is like because that is another divide that is happening here. So opening half has mostly talked about class divides, but obviously having these really segregated schools also leads to religious divides. We also have skill divides with like these strict selective schools, etc. So we think it's better to have like different religions, different classes, different skill levels mixed in one school where there's more diversity, and that leads to more tolerance and like less extremist views. Yeah, and then on like why our substantive with on the grants is important and is a reason why the current system is not working, and why we definitely shouldn't like push for more private schools. So as we explained to you at government member, a huge share of the grants is currently going into the private school system, which leads to that to those schools like being even more advantaged than they already are through receiving all these school fees and just having vastly more resources, better infrastructure, better teachers, etc., than public schools. And opposition half would push to increase that even more by like cutting taxes, providing more scholarships, etc., which is all like costing even more of that grant money, sending even more of that grant money to the private school sector, rather than making sure that we have a good public school sector. Opposition talks about how government has limited resources. We think in that case, don't send them to private schools, like divert them to the public school sector and make sure that that one is functional and good. Just a brief example on like how this is realistic, like Finland has one of the best education systems in the world, and private schools are literally banned there, and like there's only one school type that everyone goes to. So this is very much realistic and it works. And so we think grants shouldn't be sent to private schools, but instead we want to make sure that everyone has access to a good public school system. Thank you.
I think you're done with the speech, and the opposition with the debate. Anything else?
Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so just in my speech, I'm just going to kind of go through each of like the different sides, starting with opening government and then going into closing government, and finally opening opposition, and kind of why like the model put forward by my government member really kind of just goes for the real heart of this issue, and it broadens the kind of whole issue to like access in general, and kind of like the economic benefits of that, which is kind of a whole circle argument. So just starting with like opening government, they kind of like put through this kind of like whole argument that private schools are like basically fundamentally inequitable. But under their kind of idea where they're limiting choice in schooling altogether to just strictly public schools and cutting out private schooling altogether, basically kind of almost makes it inequitable to start with, because you're narrowing people's choice. You're forcing them into choosing
only between like a very selective number of schools that kind of like and like not specialized if that's something that you're looking for. It's kind of like, it means that parents aren't kind of getting a say to kind of like go into what they kind of look at all of the schooling available, whether that's public or private or a certain specialized school, and kind of enabling the parent to then kind of look at all of that and then take that into account when choosing a school that really is fits the needs for their specific child. So and that kind of like and like this whole idea that it supposedly removes disadvantage and like just generational wealth, but then as my member put forward, just because you kind of choose to send your kid to a private school, there are like government funding available. Under the model provided in the info slide, it talked about scholarships would be made available to students. There's the taxation in the program that kind of is also available to kind of increase funding for people that kind of can't really afford like the insane kind of like schooling kind of pricing, and kind of like increasing kind of like the whole like district boards and etc. And also private schools vary in their price of schooling education anyway, and so like you can kind of take that into account, as the opening opposition kind of brought up. You can take that into account and then kind of choose based on your income kind of and the needs of your child specifically what kind of school really best fits them. And kind of like this whole kind of like argument around like doing what this kind of whole debate really comes down to is what is best for the child, what is best for their needs, so that they can kind of get the best quality of education possible. They can have the most access to education as possible, which then enables them to kind of go into greater job opportunities, and it enables them to kind of get a more secure job. It enables them to go into fields of study that they want to go into, and doesn't kind of limit them in the sense that they didn't kind of get that more well-rounded education system. They also kind of like said this whole kind of like social aspect that the bubbles would disappear in public schools, breaking down like barriers, but like people like the whole like kind of with that, it doesn't really like solve, like just because you happen to choose to send your kid to a private school doesn't necessarily actually mean that you come from like a really wealthy background. You could be on a scholarship, you could be kind of like that kind of side of it. And it would, like they said, it would lead to a more accepting society through exposure to different people. But you also get that through no matter what schooling you go to, you're getting exposure to different cultures, you're getting exposure to different kind of wealth of people. Private schools also enable a lot of opportunities to kind of like go on like that trip where you kind of go and help out in developing rural areas, kind of helping out with like drought relief programs and kind of like that whole side of it and feeding back into community. So they also kind of said this whole point that co-curriculars aren't important to education, and then claiming that that kind of doesn't tie into like a well-rounded education. But like we'd actually argue that co-curricular activities do kind of increase access to a range they do kind of increase they lead to a more rounded education and are more important in terms of like social development for the child themselves, and that kind of aspect to it. I'll take your point from closing.
Okay, so if choice is so important, how does your system ensure that every single low SES student can access each one of these choices?
So as my member kind of like put through, she really went through in detail kind of all of the kind of mechanisms involved. And as is kind of stated in the info slide itself, there is like the government funding available to these students to kind of increase as much access as possible to a breadth of educational opportunities, whether that happens to be public education if you happen to go into that, or whether the child is more best suited to a private school where it's a kind of smaller classroom sizes, where they can kind of like aren't kind of being stuck going underneath the radar, kind of being ignored, which can occur in a much bigger classroom space, which is quite often the case in a lot of public schooling. So then it kind of like moving on to kind of like closing government, they kind of like had like this whole kind of religion argument that going to like a religious school, a private school, and like going to the weekly mass would mean that there's like a lot of students sitting there disinterested, but that's a very generalized statement. For students in general. Like, yes, you might have a few students that aren't particularly interested in the maths, but they're getting exposed to kind of the more bigger cultural exposure to what kind of like certain different religions, different aspects to that, and kind of like going to church. They kind of provided this kind of other side that you're better off going to a church. But then by just going to a church and not kind of having the exposure within the school itself, it closes off this kind of access to strictly religious families.
if, for instance, you're like me and don't come from a religious background, if I say, for instance, didn't go to a school where it exposed me to like different religions and different kind of that kind of side of it, as like a kind of argument that like I would just go to church with my family kind of thing, kind of like really just limits that altogether. They also kind of like said that under the public system, you desensitize. Hang on. They also kind of said like the well-rounded education by excluding access to. I don't understand how you could get a well-rounded education by excluding access to certain schools, such as private schools or specialized education systems, as that kind of like basically narrows the choice anyway and makes it a very inequitable choice because you're no longer getting access to a wider breadth of education opportunities. And then it kind of like, just to kind of like really summarize what our key points were, it was all about kind of like this kind of like increasing the quality of education, increasing the access to education is really what this case really comes down to. And it is why we come over opening opposition, because it kind of broadens the scope of this debate to something much wider. And kind of, as my member kind of set out, it has much wider breadth of kind of impacts to society that are very, very positive. As you get a greater quality of education, it means that you can then go into like greater job opportunities. This job opportunities means that you've got a higher income. The higher income means that you can then kind of like increase spendage, which then means that you're then feeding back into the economy. So then all of these grants can kind of go back into it. And I'm proud to oppose.
If opposition would they be? I'm going to support by hands. You might take one. I will pause our comment. Good idea.